for whom the lecture series would not have been possible tonight include the following organizations and campus groups: the Hall Center for the Humanities, the Spencer Art Museum, the Center for Global and International Studies, the Department of Anthropology, the Department of Religious Studies, and the Commons. Before we begin tonight, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the interview tonight, we will have some time for audience questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student helper will bring a microphone to you. Please ask just one brief question. So now I would like to introduce you to Professor Su.
Good evening. Our speaker today is Andy Carvin, a senior strategist on National Public Radio's social media desk. If you're like me, waking up in the morning with NPR and tuning into NPR as whenever possible, Andy has been an important source of information about recent uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa. Andy has been a prolific pastor of information about social media use in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Bahrain. And from his Twitter handle at @Carvin, he has engaged in a global conversation on the topic of today's event, the use of social media in the Arab Spring. This topic has important implications for activism in the network information society. Andy is former director of the Digital Divide Network, an online community of internet activists working to bridge the digital divide. He also writes about education and technology for PBS.org. He's the author of EdWeb, Exploring Technology and Social Reform. He has received numerous recognitions for his role in the technology area, including being named in 2005 by Technology Review magazine as one of the 35 leading high-tech innovators under the age of 35. An award for which he would be no longer eligible.
Thank you.
And Andy holds a Bachelor of Science in Rhetoric.
This wasn't part of the deal.
And a Master of Arts in Telecommunication Policy from Northwestern University. He will be interviewed by Dole Institute Director Bill Lacey. Now I will turn it over to them.
Thank you. Welcome, Andy, everybody.
Thank you.
I thought we were going to lose you there for a half second.
That's all right.
That's the first time anybody's done that. That was very funny. Tell us about your early years, your education, and how you developed an interest in the internet that ultimately led you to where you are today.
So I don't have a background as a journalist. I didn't study journalism. My university work at Northwestern, my undergraduate degree was in rhetoric and religion, which didn't exactly prepare me for the real world. So I stuck around and got a master's degree in telecommunications science and policy. So for the early parts of my career, I was a policy wonk. But I would probably have to rewind even further than that to my childhood, because I grew up on the Space Coast of Central Florida, not too far south of NASA. And I'm probably one of the oldest digital natives out there. I mean, I'm not part of the millennial generation, but we had computers in my first grade classroom back in the late 70s. And the first time I went online, I think, was 1984. If I remember correctly, when I was 12, 13 years old. And so I lived in a very strange area that gave me access to really smart people that were playing around with tools that didn't really seem to have a point yet, but still seemed rather curious. And so by the time I got out of college, even though I didn't study internet policy or internet technology when I was in college, I saw it as something I wanted to keep working with. And so the very first online project I did, which you mentioned a moment ago, was a website called EdWeb from 1994. And the idea behind it was to look at how changes in telecommunications policy would potentially affect changes in education policy, because at that point, people were musing at the idea of bringing internet into the classroom, but it really hadn't started yet. The website did fairly well for the particular audience it was aimed at. And in some ways it backfired, because I started getting emails from some very smart people who knew a lot more on the subject than I do, and they were asking me very tough questions. And since I didn't have many answers for them, I decided, well, wouldn't it be better if I could get all these people to talk among themselves? So in October '94, I created my first online community, and it was an email list dedicated to the role of the web in education, and it's been running for 18 years now. And it really brought home to me this idea that getting a group of people to talk openly and share their expertise and experiences can be a lot more powerful than doing things the same old way behind the scenes. And so throughout my career, whatever I've been doing, whether it's in education technology or policy wonk, or now that I'm at NPR, I've really tried to embrace the notion of online communities really being about community and not just being a place online. And that these are communities of real people with stories to share and expertise to share. And if we give them opportunities to share that knowledge, the sky's the limit.
Let's jump right into Arab Spring. At what point, at what event, what kind of, in your mind, made you think, wow, something's going on over there?
Well, when I was running the Digital Divide Network in the early mid-2000s, I had a number of chances to travel overseas, including a couple of trips to Tunisia in 2004, 2005. And I got to know a number of the local bloggers there, as well as some bloggers in exile who had been forced out of the country because of their political writings. I didn't know them very well, but they invited me for coffee when I was there, and we kept in touch through email and our blogs. And that was always kind of hovering in the background as something I was interested in. And while I was there, I also got to experience the police apparatus firsthand, because I had been at a UN event beforehand, and I was blogging rather openly about human rights issues. And when I stuck around the country for an extra week afterwards, they went out of their way to make sure that I knew that they were paying attention to what I was writing. And so in 2010, in that December, one of those very bloggers happened to be in the US on business. He was there on December 18th, and we got together in DC for coffee. And we talked about all sorts of stuff, and then I remember asking him, so how are things at home? And he knew what I was getting at, and he just kind of shrugged and said, some things never change. And he clearly did not want to talk about the political situation there. What we didn't know is that very moment, or that very day, there was a young man in Tunisia in a town called Sidi Bouzid named Mohamed Bouazizi, whose produce cart had been confiscated by a corrupt government official because he wouldn't pay a bribe. And so he decided to protest it by carrying a can of gasoline to the local government building and setting himself on fire. And he died several weeks later, but within hours of him attempting suicide on that day, relatives and friends came out and organized a solidarity protest for him in front of this building. And someone recorded a video of that. And that video quickly made its way online to some of those bloggers that I'd gotten to know a few years beforehand. And they must have realized that there was something really, really important that was about to happen, because they started to subvert the censors as best as they could, getting the video out in different places. And then all of a sudden, solidarity protests started happening in different places. So it was probably about 4 days into this, like around the 22nd or 23rd, I started seeing them tweeting about it using the keyword hashtag Sidi Bouzid. And when I realized that there were protests happening, I just sat back and thought, wow, this isn't supposed to happen there. And I remember on December 28th, while I was observing this over the holidays, I tweeted, I wonder if this could really become a Jasmine Revolution, in which I thought would be an interesting way to describe it, because the jasmine is the national flower there. And apart from the Tunisians, no one knew what I was talking about, because Tunisia isn't part of our national mindset of what the Middle East is about. It was essentially a non-entity in Mideast politics as far as we were concerned. And so no one in the West was really covering the protests as they grew, but they grew and grew, and exactly 4 weeks to the day that that young man set himself on fire, the president was forced to flee the country in the first populist revolution in modern Arab history.
How did you find yourself all during Arab Spring kind of at the center of information exchange?
Well, I don't know if I was at the center of it. I think, the way social media works is, anyone can choose to feel like they are the center or the periphery of any given conversation, depending on how much they want to involve themselves in it. And so for much of the Tunisian revolution, I felt I was on the periphery, because I wasn't there. I didn't know all the players on the ground, but I knew just enough to get myself in trouble and want to talk about it on Twitter. And it really wasn't until like the last 72 hours of the revolution when the police started getting very violent against protesters, and they really started to spread towards the Capitol, did I start ignoring my regular job duties and just trying to keep on Twitter as long as possible, and on YouTube pasting these things, pasting all these things together into some coherent narrative. As far as I know, I was really the only person working in a Western news organization that was attempting to do that before it became so self-evident that everyone started sending people over there. And so a few days later, when stories started to spread online that the Egyptians were going to maybe have their own protest on January 25th, people just would casually ask me, so are you going to cover that too? And so, I don't know, we'll see what happens. And so I put it on my Outlook calendar so I wouldn't forget that it was happening. And suddenly those protests exploded into a national uprising. And the next thing I knew, within a matter of days, I was on Twitter 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, talking with protesters, doing essentially live anchor coverage of what was happening on the ground in Tahrir Square, even though I was 5,000 miles away in D.C.
Now, just to give everybody a little bit of context, because I bet a lot of people here tonight think your job is to cover social media for NPR. What's your job at NPR?
My title is Senior Strategist. Yeah, and it's supposed to elicit that reaction because when I was hired at NPR 5.5 years ago, social media staff at news organizations didn't exist yet. I was brought in, I was recruited by a woman who was vice president then, a woman named, for digital, a woman named Maria Thomas, who felt that over time NPR would have to learn to interact better with the online public because that was going to become more important. But what they would do beyond that, no one really had an idea. So she asked if I wanted to come on board and tinker, essentially. And so I purposely chose the title Senior Strategist at one point because I wanted to confound people. And confounding people can be important in a newsroom because if my title were producer or editor or reporter, there would be certain expectations of what I could and couldn't do. There would be a hierarchy within the org chart that would allow me to do certain things and not allowed to do other things. Senior strategist, there's no place for a senior strategist in an org chart, so no one's going to bother me. And so as long as I had a supportive boss who allowed me to basically be guinea pig in residence at NPR, I could get away with running my own experiments. And so over the last 5 years, actually a lot of my time before the Arab Spring was spent doing social media reporting experiments relating to politics and natural disasters. So in 2008, we were we might have been the very first news organization on Twitter because we actually joined in late 2007. And during presidential debates, we would use Twitter to fact check. And we would ask members of Twitter to pay careful attention to what the candidates were saying. And if they could prove what the candidates were saying was incorrect, and they could supply us with a primary source to back it up, we asked them to tweet it with the keyword fact check, and we would monitor that. So during each debate, it was the equivalent of us having 150 research assistants working for us as volunteers. And of course, you had more than your fair share of fact check. McCain's an idiot, fact checked, Obama's a jerk. But once you got over those partisan tweets, there would be people saying, fact check. If you look at this PDF from the Congressional Budget Office, page 234, you will find this line item and it does not match what the candidate just said. I mean, it was that wonky. And it really struck me as Twitter is one of the geekiest places I've ever been, and these are my kind of people. Because most of them, they weren't professional wonks. These were people who had certain things they were passionate about, and they developed their own areas of expertise in it. Whether they were ever going to get paid on it, it didn't matter. This was their passion and their area of expertise. And suddenly, I started to understand that if you just molded the right conversations on Twitter, you could tap into that collective knowledge and do more than any newsroom could do on its own.
Thinking back through various things that occurred over the course of what we call Arab Spring tonight, what would you cite as a couple of cases, a couple or three, where social media really had a profound importance in the outcome?
In terms of the revolutions or in terms of the reporting or both?
The revolutions.
Okay. In the case of Egypt, Egypt's a fascinating story because they basically used Facebook as the RSVP for the revolution. They told people a couple weeks ahead of time, save the date, January 25, please show up. And so many of the people who were there that first day found out about it through social media. And over time, it started to grow. But what's interesting is, I think the tipping point for the revolution was when social media got shut off because Mubarak pulled the plug on the internet. I think it was on the 28th or the 29th of January. And what he didn't realize is that with 20% of the population using the internet regularly in Egypt and suddenly not having access to it, and so many other forms of communications being shut down by the government, the only option they had was to go outside and talk to their neighbors about what had just happened and what was going on. So they started assembling in public places. And so unwittingly, the government created this viral sense of public assembly that had never happened before. And then when they turned the internet back on, you had people in all of these places with their cell phones prepared to report on what was happening in each of these places. And so during some of the main protests in Tahrir Square, on any given day there might be 30, 40 people tweeting in real time and uploading videos, and this would create this feedback loop with news organizations like Al Jazeera to get footage out, which would then go through satellite to other parts of Egypt where people would see it. And so social media wasn't necessarily in charge of the revolution, but it was accelerating it because it knew how to get around state authorities and become available by other means. In other cases, such as both Libya and in Syria, for various periods of time, it was impossible to get reporters in safely. There were, like the first several weeks of the Libyan Revolution, there were no Western reporters there. And so we had to rely solely on what we could find out through the internet, really. But only about 5% of the Libyan population was online, and so it took a bit of work to figure out who these people were and where to find them. But once you figured that out, suddenly there was an incredible stream of information coming out. People were setting up live streams. They were setting up YouTube channels. They were uploading extremely compelling footage that had never been seen before outside of the country. And so while the Libyans weren't necessarily organizing their revolutions using social media, their use of citizen journalism was so effective, I would argue, that it played a role in the decision for NATO to bomb the country.
Explain for us, Andy, the concept of crowdsourcing and how it's used.
Crowdsourcing is a fancy schmancy internet word for groups of people working together. That's really all it means. It's often used in the context of companies tapping into populations of people across the internet to work on complicated problems or to solve other things. But it's not new. The very first newspaper in the United States, the first independent paper, which was published in the 1680s, it's called Public Occurrences, and it was a 4-page broadsheet. But on those 4 pages, only 3 pages were printed. They left the 4th page blank because they had a limited print run, and they would leave copies of it around the local public houses, and people could scribble the latest news on it and pass it on to the next person. And so literally the history of American journalism begins with crowdsourcing and collaborative journalism, but we don't remember that. In the 1860s, during the Civil War, the Confederate newspapers would publish intercepted telegrams from the North, and because they were encoded, and they would ask the public to help crack them. Think more recently to things such as the Unabomber. We might have never caught that guy if they hadn't posted his manifesto in papers and had a relative recognize the writing style. So these are all examples of crowdsourcing, taking a certain problem or issue and exposing it to a wide array of people as possible in order to solve something. And that's basically what I do on Twitter and other types of social media. I try to pool together groups of people until they form a critical mass of expertise or eyewitnesses on something, and experiment with forms of collaborative journalism from there.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever have any worries that some of the violent images and the coverage through social media might desensitize people to violence?
Absolutely.
or feed into a stereotype of Muslim people?
I don't worry about the stereotype, honestly, because I think for every violent video that I've seen coming from the Arab Spring, there are 10 other videos of people defiantly marching, holding the hands of their grandchildren. One thing that occurred to me sometime last spring is I thought, I think Americans will never look at the phrase Allahu Akbar the same way again because of the awful stereotype of thinking that's associated with suicide bombers or whatever. Instead, we're seeing it people chanting in the streets to steel themselves against a police attack or to protest the regime. And so there was just so much footage coming out of the region that I think makes large swaths of the world very proud of what they've been trying to do. But the downside are these videos that come out, but at the same time I would argue, the violent videos that is. But you know, it's interesting because every now and then, I tend to post a lot of these violent videos on Twitter. I'm very blunt about it. I'll say, this is a very graphic video of 3 children that were blown apart by a mortar. And possibly describe it even more bluntly than that. And my Twitter followers are used to it because I've been doing this from day one. And the way I've always presented to them is I feel like this is an opportunity for them to bear witness if they choose to, and also the opportunity to document what's going on. And when people respond and say, well, you know, mass media is not supposed to show footage like that, my response is, well, mass media couldn't show footage like that because for so many decades, mass media was intended for family consumption. If you look at the history of newspapers in America or the history of television, these were things that were experienced as a family or another community unit. And so if you suddenly sat down over breakfast with a newspaper showing lots of dead children on the front page, it was not going to go over well. But with the advent of the internet and social media and citizen journalism, people have the choice to follow me on Twitter. They then have the choice to decide whether or not to view these videos. And I imagine most people don't, because I try to warn people not to watch them. But I want to give people the choice as well. And NPR has given me complete latitude to do this because I think they also understand that the standards of what would be acceptable content in terms of violent imagery is different through social media because of those choice factors.
Do you have a sense of at what point, say in Egypt or Libya or Tunisia, when the citizens there realized that they were empowered by social media and that they could use social media to you know, pursue their objectives?
I think it's different in every country just because of the sheer differences. Like, you know, in Bahrain, like 80 or 90% of the population has internet access. In Yemen, it's like 3%. And so the dynamics of social media use in those countries are going to be so different. And depending on when a country really got involved, it also affects things. So like in Tunisia, it started completely off the radar, and so they were able to get away with a lot on Facebook of sharing lots of videos and photos before authorities realized what was happening. In the case of Egypt, the main Facebook group where much of this was planned had been around since the previous summer. And so I think in many cases, these were activists who were waiting for the right moment. And I don't think they were necessarily waiting for a social media moment or anything like that. I think from their perspective, these are digital natives who don't separate their online lives from their offline lives. So when they were prepared to act, of course they were going to use social media because they don't do anything else without it. It's just a part of who they are. And so I don't think there were necessarily many people who had an aha moment who said, using Twitter is going to, you know, put us over the top and we're going to win this revolution. I think there were other factors that came into play. So I think when the first very large crowds came into Tahrir Square and they held the square after those people came in on camelback and horseback to attack them, and there were other pivotal moments in Egypt that I think buoyed them even further. In Libya, I've talked to people who've said they felt as early as like December 20th, like 3 or 4 days into the revolution, that they were going to win because they had been able to survive 3 or 4 days without getting wiped out. And that was enough of a sign for them. And so it's, you know, it's hard to pinpoint exactly because every country is different and every person has been different. But I think they don't dwell on it either because it's so innate to them.
What do you think? You've interacted with hundreds, probably thousands, maybe tens of thousands, maybe hundreds. It's hard to say. Maybe not personally, but they read your tweets and pass it on.
I had a software developer go through my tweets to see how many people I've replied to over the last year, and it was around 2,000 different people.
Okay, wow. But then they may have circulated those.
Right.
My question is, you've been in contact with a lot of people. Do you have an opinion, just an opinion or a feeling for why these uprisings succeeded in Egypt and Libya and failed in Syria?
Well, define succeeded for one thing.
Okay.
You know, if you were in Cairo right now, I think you might be scratching your head and wondering if you actually did succeed. The whole process of getting the government in order and having free and fair elections has been quite the mess. They were supposed to have a presidential election in about 6 weeks, and they keep changing their mind as to who's eligible to run and who's not, and it's just a total nightmare. And you know, a large part of the protesting establishment were fairly liberal, fairly secular, and the Muslim Brotherhood has grown significantly because they were always a part of the Egyptian culture and community. They just didn't have the chance to flourish because they were illegal before. And so the revolutionaries are facing some pretty harsh realities there. In the case of Libya, there's a lot of gloom and doom being reported about how things are going there, but when I was there last month, every person except one that I can remember was optimistic about the future. And they weren't necessarily saying that we're going to have clean, free and fair democracy in the short term, but they felt it was important for them to stay in Libya and start founding NGOs and other civil society organizations. And to me, that is such a huge step for them to get it right. And so I'm still fairly bullish on, over time, the Libyans figuring it out. But then you've got a place like Yemen where literally 500,000 people would protest every single week. 100 people or so would die every single week, and ultimately the president got away with it. He waited and waited and waited until he got a sweet enough deal to get complete immunity. He retired and then basically set up the government so his sons could have as much power as possible. So I think if you ask the average revolutionary there, they weren't necessarily successful. And so, you know, ultimately it all boils down to the country's internal dynamics. I don't think it has to do necessarily with how well they used or didn't use social media. I think the only case where that might be a possibility is where in Bahrain, because the government in Bahrain was really the only one that understood the propaganda power of social media, and that they fought back as aggressively on social media as they did in the streets.
Okay. How would you describe the role you played? Were you a journalist? Were you a participant? Would you describe it some other way?
It depends on the day. You know, it's funny because as I'm doing all of this, I tend to use the term journalist in a very broad sense of the term. In some ways, it's almost more accurately describe what I'm doing as a form of real-time documentary making, because not everything that I am collecting and sharing is intended to be news. Sometimes it's just capturing emotions on the ground and having the stories speak for themselves. Some people have compared the work I do to a form of DJing, where I'm basically grabbing all these feeds and beats in real time and spinning them back out to the public in some form of way that people are going to want to dance to, essentially. It's a strange comparison, but in some ways it really makes sense in terms of the actual workflow of what I do. In terms of me being an activist, I don't see myself as an activist. I've been very careful about not getting involved in the politics of any of these protests. But you know, anytime you're involved in covering a story of this magnitude, the sheer act of covering a revolution shines light on it, and the last thing a dictator wants is light on whatever it is they're doing, and the last thing they want is transparency as to what's happening. And so I think one can argue that journalism is a revolutionary act by definition, whether I'm the one trying to cover what's going on in a country or citizen journalists are trying to do it, because especially in their cases, simply, even if they're not seeing themselves as activists, if they try to just go out and report what's going on, it's treasonous. And so, by definition, they have taken a side by trying to document the truth. And so, you know, I don't see journalism as this dialectic where we have to say, oh, well, it's time for the dictator to get his 5 minutes because we just gave the protesters 5 minutes. You know, I'm comfortable calling a dictator and a thug, but I also want to be as transparent as possible and try to keep everyone honest. And so when protesters start engaging in propaganda or anything that I see as BS, I call them on it too, which has blown up in my face on several occasions because some protesters just assumed that I was quote-unquote working with them because I was covering them. They're not, because of the way media works in their country, they assume that any type of coverage would only be done by someone who actually believes in what they're covering, because everything is so skewed normally, and the whole notion of just trying to cover the facts is alien to them. But In some ways, I think my work on Twitter over the last year has been one of the weirdest global media literacy experiments ever, because it's exposing a lot of these people to their first taste of how journalism works. And some could argue that by doing that, it makes them better citizen journalists, which makes them more effective in their causes. So where does that put me in terms of being on the barricades? I don't know. But I try to cover it as fairly and reasonably as possible.
Did you ever, were you ever in a situation where you were threatened or felt actually in personal danger?
Yeah, there have been a couple of times, and unfortunately I can't talk about them. Basically, when I think any journalist receives a type of threat, their organization goes into security mode, and it's dealt with in an appropriate manner. I never felt, let's put it this way, I've never felt that any of the threats I've ever received were serious, but we also take all threats seriously. So, but it's also a weird world that I live in, because, you know, many of the times I know that these are Twitter accounts run by people halfway around the world, and they're just trying to be trolls and cause trouble. But at the same time, like I said, you have to take these things seriously. Yeah, so there have been a couple of unfortunate incidents, but nothing that truly freaked me out. They just had to be dealt with.
But I believe that on at least one occasion, maybe more, you were like very close to the scene of some sort of part of the uprising?
Well, until last June, I did all of my coverage of the Arab Spring remotely. I was in the U.S. basically the entire time. And then finally that June, I had a chance to be in Egypt for just on business, and so I carved out a few extra days to meet some of these revolutionaries. And one of them on Twitter said, "Hey, great idea for a cocktail party and meetup." And so the next thing I know, I'm at this cafe, a garden cafe on the rooftop somewhere in downtown Cairo, where 40 or so of the leading revolutionary Twitterati were there drinking their non-alcoholic beers and smoking their cigarettes and having a grand old time telling me their war stories. And then in the distance, we hear a pop, 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 pop. And immediately, everyone pulls out their phones. They also all recognized what it was. It wasn't gunfire, it was tear gas going off. And as soon as they pulled out their phones, they started getting tweets and text messages from people who were there describing what was going on. The 40 people in that cafe cleared out within 5 minutes, and they did it in 3 waves. The first waves were the ones who were prepared to go to the barricades and throw rocks back at the police. The second waves were the ones who brought their cameras and were prepared to cover the first wave and document what was going on. And the third wave, who were trying to be as hospitable as possible about me and didn't want to get me killed, so they kind of formed a cordon around me and tried to usher me into a car to go back to my hotel. And I said, well, the tear gas is that way. Can't we go in that direction? And so I tweeted, I literally tweeted something like, famous last words, hearing tear gas shots in Tahrir Square. Think I'm going to go check it out. We got within like half a block or a block of Tahrir Square until we found ourselves stuck between police lines. There were dozens of police in front of us facing in the other direction, and rocks were flying over them towards us. Behind me were reinforcements, riot police, waiting to go into action. And there were like 3 or 4 of us caught in the middle, and so all we could do there was stand like idiots for 30 minutes, try to pretend that, you know, maybe we're supposed to be there for some reason. And, you know, they tried to get me to smoke a cigarette so I would blend in, but I'm like, guys, I don't smoke. No, Andy, smoke a cigarette, come on. I don't know, I was probably there for about 30 minutes. It's hard to tell when all this stuff is going on. But, you know, just in front of me, you could hear that there were thousands of people somewhere behind those riot police. Tear gas was so strong, not only was it in my eyes, I could taste it. It was on my clothes for days. I discovered, here's a pro tip when it comes to tear gas. If you get tear gas, do not take a hot shower afterwards. Take a very cold shower, because if you do take a hot one, it will basically reignite all the fumes. And don't touch your clothes, put them in a bag, and get them washed as soon as possible. I had to find that out all the hard way, unfortunately. So here I am in the middle of all this action, seeing, hearing, smelling, feeling, tasting what's going on, but I had no idea what was going on. I just didn't know. I just knew there was a big crowd of people behind those police, and anything beyond that was, you know, I could only guess. And it wasn't until we managed to get out of there and I was able to pull up my phone and really stare at my Twitter timeline did I realize that there had been a group of families of those who had been killed earlier who were trying to arrange a memorial at some local theater. Police came and shut it down. It turned into a scuffle, which turned into a fight, which turned into a melee in which over 1,000 people were injured that night. 5,000 people throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails at the police and back. And there's no way I would have known any of that if it hadn't been for Twitter. All I knew is there was a fight happening over there, my eyes are burning, and I don't know what's going on. And it was really at that moment that I realized that the type of work I've been doing on Twitter is complementary to work on the ground, because it takes a field reporter or a combat reporter to tell those visceral stories that you only get from being there in person. But then the type of journalism I'm doing is providing a form of situational awareness or collective intelligence by tapping into so many people at once. It may not be the deep level of the same visceral nature of what you experience in person, but it allows you to piece together things that you probably couldn't if you were hunkering down in one spot as Molotovs are flying over your head. And so it was a real eye-opening moment for me.
I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to open it up to Q&A, and we have plenty of time for Q&A from the audience in just a moment. So be thinking about your question. We have lots of students here. I would encourage you guys to ask questions. But Andy, there are a lot of students here, a lot of other people probably are here to find out about Arab Spring, but somebody's probably here to find out about, how can they better utilize social media. And if you could point to a couple of examples of places where they can go or ways that they can learn about really skillful use of social media, where would you point them to?
It's tough because honestly I don't pay careful attention to, these are the places you go to learn. Personally for me, I always find that I get better at something by figuring it out on my own. And what I've discovered is that in pretty much any online community I've ever joined, people are welcoming to new people as long as you go in admitting that you're new and you don't totally understand what's going on. Like for journalists, the worst thing they can do is create a Twitter account the day a big story breaks and show up and say, hi, I'm so-and-so from this news outfit and I need you to give me sourcing information or whatever. I mean, people on Twitter hate that because you're intruding on their community. Whereas if you just join one day and say, hey, I'm a journalist, I want to learn the ropes of Twitter, who should I be paying attention to, who should I be learning from? People on Twitter open up. People on Facebook open up. I think the greatest currencies on social media, and Twitter in particular, are generosity, knowledge, and skills, in no particular order. I suppose generosity encompasses all of them, but when you go into these communities, there is often an expectation that if you are going to gather skills and information from other people, you're expected to give back to the community as well. I remember during September 11th, one of my friends online described the project I was doing as giving blood back to the net. And that's always stuck with me because so much of the best things that happen on social media and online communities in general are because people are working together, admitting their limitations, admitting their strengths, and being transparent about it. And so, I can't really suggest go here to learn about this tool or that tool or which software you should be using for Twitter or whatever. All I can tell you is that these are communities of real people, people who want to be listened to, who want respect, but also have amazing senses of humor and amazing stories to tell. And so especially if you're in journalism or going into journalism, you have to drop that artifice of you being over here and the audience being over there. Because on Twitter, there's no difference. On Facebook, there's no difference. Either you're a part of the community or you're not. And you display your own arrogance at your peril.
Okay. All right, we're going to open up to Q&A. We should have a couple of students who are exiting the office right on schedule with cordless mics. If you have a question, please raise your hand. I won't recognize you. A student will find you. So try to get either Jen's attention or Quinn's attention. And please ask a question, no statements, please.
Thank you. You used experimentation as your analogy for describing the license that your work title allowed you. As you're testing things, what are your indicators? What do you regard as the key indicators of success for the things you're testing? And what side effects do you most worry about?
There are a variety of indicators. The ones I don't pay attention to are page views and hits. and the number of Twitter followers I have, because I find most of that pretty meaningless in terms of creating quality journalism. And so when I look at these projects, the first thing I ask is, were we able to report or conduct journalism in a way that we covered something from a whole new angle, made our sourcing more diverse, or prevented something important from falling through the cracks? And so in many ways, the indicators I use aren't that different from a managing editor in a newsroom as to whether or not they've had a good week in terms of what they're reporting. Which makes it hard to keep track of. You know, it's not like I can have a spreadsheet that says, we're proud of these 5 stories and we reach these different diverse groups of sources or whatever. It's the kind of thing that you know it when it happens. But one thing I do notice is that, for example, in the 2008 election, I was social media for NPR. There was no one else. So if you saw NPR Politics on Twitter or anything else, hi, that was me. Whereas now, pretty much everyone in our election unit is using social media in one way or another. Not only running the main Twitter accounts, but running their own, using them as part of their reporting, engaging the public to improve the questions they have for candidates or to find policy issues that might be falling through the cracks. To me, that's the ultimate sign of success. When I don't have to do that work and the reporters have understood the best way to integrate it into their reporting to make their journalism better, that's success to me.
I've heard the April Spring being described as a revolution without leaders. And I think that's part of the phenomenon that you've been describing. Where does that lead to then, when you've got a revolution without a leader?
You know, it's funny, because you hear that a lot, but you also hear that about places like online, like Wikipedia. That, you know, it's a completely flat community where everyone has equal rights. But when you actually dig into it, you'll still find that there's a small group of people who are exhibiting more aspects of leadership than others and are often making critical decisions. It doesn't necessarily mean one person's in charge, but it means there still is a core group. And I think at any given revolution, if you dug into it, you will find these core people. But what's interesting is they weren't necessarily the ones who started these things. Some of these revolutions grew more organically, and leadership grew from within that organic growth. But to say that it was essentially anarchy from beginning to end with no true leadership, I mean, that's part of the romantic narrative of the Arab Spring, but it's just, I don't think it's true. You know, if pressed, I could name the top 10 people in Egypt that I thought were most influential. In Yemen, one of the protest leaders there ended up winning a Nobel Prize this year. I would argue she was a leader, even though people wouldn't necessarily talk about the Yemeni revolution as having leaders. So they're there. They just don't always exert the kind of control that you would expect during a major political event. You don't see that hierarchy. I mean, the hierarchies exist. It's funny because it plays out now through groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, which is very hierarchical. And it's allowed them to take advantage of some of these political vacuums because they have organization skills and infrastructure and the ability to canvass communities in the way that these flat, disorganized revolutionary groups don't. And so in countries like Egypt, it's coming back to haunt them because the groups that did have hierarchies beforehand, I would argue, are in a much stronger position than the revolutionaries are.
Okay, we have another question right here.
To our election, what role do you see social media playing, and will it replace TV advertising to any extent?
Nothing will get replaced. I mean, look at the millions that have been spent already. But at the same time, I don't know of any campaign that is serious about their campaigns that's ignoring social media now. 4 years ago, you could sort of get away with it. The Obama campaign was pretty aggressive, experimenting. Working for them was one of the early founders of Facebook. And one thing they did that I think was very smart, thinking, you know, now looking back on it, is they had their social network on their website. You know, it was My Barack Obama or whatever it was called. But one of the main purposes of that website was to get people to identify who was in their communities and meet them in person. And so they were one of the first campaigns to recognize that it's not about moving things to social media. It's about integrating the online activism with the offline activism and creating a virtuous cycle between them. And so in the 2008 cycle, I think you could easily argue that the Democrats owned Twitter. Now you can't say that because the Republicans have gotten really, really savvy at social media in the last few years. During the last campaign, the 2008 campaign, the internet strategist for Romney, for example, Mindy Finn, she's gone off and founded a consultancy with a couple other very social media savvy young campaigners, and they've done extraordinary work teaching other campaigns how to use social media effectively. I mean, Ron Paul, I mean, he didn't need help from anyone because their campaign from day one has got it, and they're really amazing at social media. And so social media is just a part of the campaign now. I mean, is it going to change things? Well, I don't know. We haven't had a macaca moment like we did in the last cycle, where I mean, how many of you remember this? Okay, good. So I don't have to go into the story. You know, as a candidate, the last thing you want to do is be caught saying something really, really dumb that's going to come back to haunt you. And it's not that, and social media in combination with citizen journalists, or anyone with a camera for that matter, increases the likelihood of people saying something. It doesn't change whether they're going to say it, but the more likelihood that it's going to surface and spread very quickly. Because every candidate gets tired and frustrated at some moment and says something they probably shouldn't. The difference is they now have cameras trained on them at all times. And so that's still probably one of the major concerns of how social media can affect a campaign. But only time will tell as to whether the organizing principles of social media play the same kind of role it did in the 2008 cycle for Obama.
Hi. You early on in the interview, you mentioned a story about the 2008 campaign where you used the hashtag #FactCheck and were able to use the crowd, so to speak, to come up with original or primary sources in order to fact check. And that strikes me as something that's very different from the situation you described in Libya, where there's nobody that you know on the ground, and you have to somehow build that network without there being any sort of primary source that you can. They're not talking about the congressional budget report. You know, how do you verify from over here what's going on over there, and how do you know you're not working with or retweeting Bahraini propaganda?
For one thing, before Bahrain, the governments were so ham-fisted about social media, it was obvious when they were trying to punk you. They just didn't know how to do it right. So the bigger question is, are these revolutionaries giving you accurate information? Are they exaggerating it, or is it just in the wrong context? And it's surprising how often you can fact-check it pretty close to real time. So with Libya, the very first videos that came out, people didn't really believe that this was Libya. But my Twitter followers who were from the region listened to accents, looked for landmarks, they looked at weather patterns and whether they matched that particular day that it claimed to be from. They listened to calls to prayer to see if they matched the timestamp of where it supposedly was. All sorts of other clever techniques in order to at least provide the proper context where it was recorded. Now, do we know everything about the video? Not necessarily. But does it give us enough confidence to say this is probably worth scrutinizing? Yes. And you know, I've watched thousands of videos over the last year, and the number of videos that I'd say were faked or staged, I can count on one hand. No, I changed that, on one cartoon character's hand. And there have been that few of them. There are just so many techniques you can use for scrutinizing photos and videos that even if you don't figure out the full context of them, you know when something doesn't smell right. It's a lot harder when you have a person you've never met before operating under a pseudonym saying, there's a guy with an AK-47 shooting up my house. There was this one guy in Tripoli that I just discovered like 2 days into the revolution who tweeted something to that effect. And I'm watching him tweet this. The guy clearly sounds terrified in the way he's tweeting. But then again, you know, I didn't know who he was. I didn't know what was going on exactly and whether I should trust him. Then all of a sudden he starts uploading photos. He was taking little twit pics of the holes in his house, and the guy standing outside holding a very large machine gun. And so, yes, it was possible that this guy who was geolocated to Tripoli was playing a hoax on me, but given the fact that there were tons of reports from Tripoli that there was fighting going on all over the place, I could be pretty sure that this guy was being sincere in his attempt to document what was happening. And so, very rarely is it a situation where someone is trying to perpetrate a hoax on you. It's much more likely that they simply don't have their information correctly. And it's just the whole, when a person whispers into one ear and then to the next and to the next, people who sincerely think they understand what's going on pass on incorrect information. And so that's more likely to happen. But even in those cases where I've tweeted a video saying, this appears to be footage from Yemen this week, someone else will watch it and say, I remember this video 6 months ago, this is Bahrain. Or they'll have some other tidbit of information. And so the more people you have involved scrutinizing this stuff, the more likely you'll be able to figure it out. And so it didn't matter that at first I literally did not know a single person in Libya. By that point, I knew enough Tunisians and Egyptians who were right next door, who knew enough about the culture and also could point me to expat Libyans living in the US that I could get on the phone with. And so, literally I went from 0 to 60 in about 48 hours building a source network there. And then once a couple of them started live streaming there, that's when things really kicked into high gear because you had stuff that you could watch in real time. And people could identify, this is Benghazi and this is why. So.
We're not getting very many questions from students, so okay, but we'll have one of those in just a moment. Okay, Jen.
Hi.
Hi.
You may have to use your imagination, but that's fine. You may have already been talking around this in it, but I'm just thinking about the role of social media, the perils and promises with regard to our traditional notions of healthy elitism, expertise, authority, and could you apply that to our major institutions, the promises, the perils, the political landscape, and do you ever foresee a day of having a virtual Congress?
Who the hell knows? I'm going to punt that one. I remember the very first article I had published after grad school. It was an article about how young people were some of the very first people getting on the internet and understanding how it works, in contrast with their parents and their teachers, and whether or not that was going to put teachers and families in an awkward position, where the children not only were technological experts, but were also able to, shine in the things that they care about the most and show what they know about it. I wrote this in 1995, and it's in so many ways that's how it's played out. In many ways, the internet can be a meritocracy, and that people build their reputations based on the quality of their ideas and their work. Now, that doesn't stop people from getting famous from doing jackass videos, and it never will. But if you are making an effort in order to find people online with certain types of expertise or engaging in certain types of discourse, you will find people rising to the top that probably would not be in that position if this were taking place offline. One of the finest experts I've gotten to know on Yemen is a woman named Jane Novak. She was the first person I found on Twitter who spoke English, who knew everything about the country, everything about the politics and the culture, and from day one was just covering it incredibly as a policy analyst. I only found out a couple of weeks ago she's a housewife from New Jersey, and that this is something that she just became interested in a few years ago, and she kind of cornered the market on it because she cared so much. There's one of the things I did a lot over the last year was trying to identify weaponry. So someone would take a picture of what looked like cluster munitions or something else that had been banned or controversial in Libya. And so we would try to figure out the make, model, manufacturer, country of origin, et cetera. And there was this one guy on Twitter who would always rise to the challenge. There were times where within 45 minutes he would say, oh, this is a landmine, this particular model. It's manufactured in Syria, but it's based on a Chinese model. Wow, you're good. And so I would check it, and it would be spot on. And so for much of the Arab Spring, he was my go-to guy on weaponry and military tactics and a few other things. It wasn't until after Tripoli fell that I discovered that he was a 15-year-old homeschool student who was just a big fan of the military channel. What does that say about expertise? You tell me.
Glenn?
Is about the social media in Syria. So after a year of violence and chaos in Syria, after more than a year, how is social media being used today? And can it be effectively used by opposition to mobilize resistance after so much time has passed?
No. Syria is a very difficult situation, not just in terms of the violence, but also just in terms of the Arab Spring timeline. Like, I constantly get asked, why is it that Egypt was able to get the world's attention so intensely and get that kind of coverage where Syria would often get ignored for months when many, many more people were getting killed? Well, the simple answer to that is Egypt had the advantage of being the only country at that moment in time that was having a revolution, and mainstream media had just been punked by missing Tunisia almost completely, and they weren't going to make that same mistake again with Egypt. When Syria started, it started somewhat slowly, and when it started, things were already going on in Bahrain, they were going on in Libya, they were going on in Yemen, and so by that point it was half a dozen countries, and it was difficult for it to get the kinds of headlines. Then the government, I think, was rather shrewd in how it killed people. As awful as to say this, it seemed to me it was rather intentional on the military's part for a very long period of time to never kill more than 20 or 25 people a day. Because if you can keep the death toll at a fairly stable level day after day, editors are going to tune out after a while. It's going to be hard for even the most passionate reporter to convince an editor that it's worth doing yet another story on a death toll that's just kind of chugging along. So whenever you see major coverage of Syria, it's been because something totally egregious and just more horrific than before has happened. I mean, you know, it finally came back into the headlines during the siege of Homs, and unfortunately it took almost the destruction of a city, a siege of a city, for the world to care again. And now it's mainly in the headlines because, you know, the UN and others are dealing with it. I think the Syrians were never really in a position to use social media as a major organizing tool in the same way that they did, for example, in Tunisia, simply because there were more people online in Tunisia with better internet access and the government never shut it down. Whereas the Assad regime, it's not unusual for them when they're about to make a maneuver into a particular city, they shut down the internet or they throttle it so it's so slow people can't upload videos. The government has also been very effective at targeting people who shoot video. Many citizen journalists in Syria have been killed over the last year. There's this one guy I know who was killed in December. His name was Bazal al-Sayed. He was mainly known for being a fearless cameraman who knew how to fix his own motorbike. And those were two of the most important things they needed in order to get that footage out. When he died, his cousin took over. He was killed when Marie Colvin was killed that same day, last month. And now another cousin has stepped in to pick up the camera. It's extraordinary the bravery that's required and that they're engaging in to do this. And so I think social media's most important role is keeping the world's attention, at least partially, on Syria. If it hadn't been for some of those citizen journalists, it's rather likely that Western journalists wouldn't have gone into Homs during the siege and cover it, so having it being covered from both angles. And if that hadn't happened, it probably wouldn't be discussed at the UN level right now. And so I very much see social media as a way of keeping the story in front of the world's eyes and documenting it, and not as much in terms of online organizing, because, you know, the Syrian government is fortunate to have Iran as a close partner, and all the amazing surveillance tools that they've had to oppress their own populations, they've now supplied to the Syrians. And so using social media within Syria is quite likely to get you killed or arrested at some point or another. So it's gotten very, very difficult there.
We have time for 2 more questions. Do you have one?
Okay. Well, hi. On Twitter, there are so many personal stories and important documentations that are just on the internet. And do you think for history's sake that we should take all of these posts and consolidate them into something like a journal or something for descendants to see what happened?
Well, I think we're probably beyond the point of having it as a journal, because we've got, during any given revolution, there are tens of thousands of artifacts, social media artifacts that have been left over. Every single tweet. There were hundreds of thousands of tweets out of Tunisia, and that was the one that people almost didn't pay attention to. Egypt, an extraordinary amount of tweets, millions of tweets, many, many millions of tweets came out of there. And that doesn't count all the videos that were either posted online or kept on people's cell phones and everything else. There are now several attempts in Egypt and outside of Egypt to document and curate that information and create an archive. It's going to take a lot of work. Excuse me. And Egypt is in a position where the internet is back on, and there are some people who can afford the time to concentrate on it. That's a bit of a luxury right now in places like Syria, and I would argue right now in Bahrain as well, because things are heating up there again. And so, in some ways, because the social media is a curse and a blessing. It's a blessing in the sense that it leaves a paper trail for all of this stuff. It's a curse in the sense that if you don't make a note of that paper trail, that you'll lose track of it within a week or two. That's why I started archiving all of my tweets last February, making a copy of it on my computer. And I also asked Twitter to give me a copy of all my tweets before that, so I now have a complete copy of my Twitter archive, including every retweet I've done by revolutionaries in the region. And I've lost track of the number of revolutionaries who've come to me and said, I don't have any of my tweets, because Twitter will only let me have access to the last couple thousand tweets. And these were 20,000 tweets ago. I don't know what I tweeted 6 months ago. And so information is already getting lost. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist anymore, but it's disappearing into the ether. And so until more of an effort is made to get access to these databases from the Twitters and Facebooks of the world, and then putting the right types of archivists and librarians on the projects to organize them in some fashion, you're going to have a very messy, decentralized slew of content all over the place, which in many ways is kind of representative of the revolutions themselves and how they played out. But certainly for history's sake, I hope that someone is able to figure out how to solve this problem.
Okay, we have one more question in the back.
Hi. In light of so many more people, I think, participating in the news-making process, citizen journalism, blogging, tweeting, it makes me think about certifications for doctors, engineers, electricians, plumbers, pretty much anything you need a certification, but none for news reporting, journalism. Is there a place for that? And
no.
And why not?
I wouldn't have a job. No, I'm serious. I mean, where is it written that you have to have a J school diploma in order to be involved in journalism? I would argue today that journalists are a profession, but journalism is an act. An act of public service that you either do professionally or you do it because it's important to your communities. And not everything a blogger does is necessarily journalism, but they are fully capable of engaging in random acts of journalism when it's necessary. And so if we had to look at some form of certification or credibility score or something that gets tabulated before we take citizen journalism seriously, probably 80% of the media that we got out of the Arab Spring would have never made it to public light, or it would have just been circulated in circles on Twitter and not made it to the mainstream media. And so, yeah, God forbid we ever have certification for people to conduct journalism. I think it's great for people to pursue degrees in journalism, but it's not a requirement. And I think we have to be very careful when we think about what rules and regulations we put upon a person before we determine that they are trying to accurately tell a story, or if they're not.
Andy, thanks so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it.